So let me start by showing, because I think one of the little known facts is just how deadly the Korean War was compared to some of the other major wars of the 20th century. This, of course, precludes, it doesn't include some of the civil wars, which are also quite deadly. But if you look at the death tolls, and I have to state up front that the estimates for these numbers are very, as you can see, the low and the highs are very large. And that's mostly because it's so difficult to actually take an accurate account of just how many people died. But if you look at the comparative numbers, the Korean War ranks right there at the top among the 4 deadliest wars of the 20th century after the 2 world wars. And the only reason I put Korean War before the Vietnam War was because of the short duration in which, the high casualty numbers took place. So between 1950 and 1953, it was only 3 years, and yet you had, up to 5 million potentially dying in this war, and the vast majority of them were civilians. And another important aspect of the Korean War that is very little known is the fact that it had major ramifications in the history of the United States. So it's the first war in which the U.S. military forces were integrated between African Americans and white soldiers. It was also the reason why we have this huge defense budget. It essentially tripled the U.S. defense budget, and it has never gone back down since. This is just to say that after World War II, the defense budget actually decreased, and people were talking about potentially having a much more vibrant budget going to things like social welfare. But then once the Korean War happened just 5 years after the end of the World War II, you had the defense budget tripling, and it has never gone back down. It's only increased since that time. Another aspect that is very little known is the fact that the US considered the use of nuclear weapons during the Korean War. Just last week was the anniversary of the atomic droppings, the dropping of the atomic bombs in Japan, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And it has not been used since, but I think it's important to remember the fact that it was actually seriously considered for use in the Korean War. And so some of the reason for why the North Korean state today is so insistent on developing its own nuclear program and having nuclear deterrence is precisely because it takes that threat very seriously coming from the United States. And then finally, another aspect that is very little known that I wanted to touch up on today was the Korean War was obviously the very first hot war during the Cold War, and it came upon the heels of World War II, so soon after the end of that very devastating war. So it really galvanized the entire world to launch an anti-war peace campaign to stop the Korean War, and women were very central in that effort. And that's also something that I think very few people know. And if you look at any documentary about the Korean War, there's almost no mention about the fact that women were a major part of the anti-war peace campaign during the Korean War. One of the major reports to come out of that activism by women against the war was this one that you see here, the cover of. It's not a very long document, and if you look for it online, you can actually find copies. So if you're interested, I encourage you to take a look at it. Some of the photos that I'll be sharing from this in the presentation today, it's from this report. And you'll notice it was commissioned by the Women's International Democratic Federation, which was basically a women's organization, an international women's organization that was formed shortly after the end of World War II. The idea was that women who were really active against the fascist developments in Europe came together and decided that they needed to create an organization to make sure that there were no other major catastrophes. But of course, the Korean War happened in 1950, so then the women really galvanized against this war. They sent 21 women from 17 different countries, and you see the countries represented here. They were not representing their governments, though, and in fact, several of the women end up having to face either getting fired or being imprisoned when they went back to their own countries because their countries were involved, or they had sent troops to join the United Nations forces on the side of the South Koreans during the war itself. These women went, I think the date was here, from May 16 to 27, 1951. And then, so they were there during the height of the war when it was very dangerous. And despite that, they took risks to be there. They were invited by two central major women leaders in North Korea at the time, Park Jung-hye, who was the chair of the Korean Democratic Women's Union, and Ho Jong-suk, who was the Minister of Culture. These two women, their activism goes back actually to the Japanese colonial period. They were considered socialist feminists and were very active in organizing students and workers in the 20s and 30s. And yet very little is written about them or known about them, you know, whether inside or outside of Korea. And so I wanted to make sure to give them a shout out about the important role that women have played also in North Korean history, despite the fact that, you know, obviously in the mainstream representations of North Korea, men end up taking center stage. So the 21 women ended up dividing into different groups as a way to, in order to cover the most areas of the country. They were basically on a mission to try to figure out what was happening in the war that was not being covered. They wanted to look at potentially war crimes being committed by those fighting in the war. One of the tragedies of this delegation was that they wanted to actually go to investigate war crimes in the South as well, but they were prevented from doing that because the Cold War was already, you know, deeply set in Korea, and so only the North Korean government gave them access, and the South Korean side did not give them access at all. They went to various sites. I mean, they were also very keen on documenting the kinds of weapons that were being used. Shortly after this delegation's visit, there were charges about the use of germ warfare on the United Nations side. And so overall, the women were very invested in making sure that they, as objectively as possible, documented what was happening on the ground that was not able to be covered by the journalists. And they were able to see the kinds of mass graves where civilians had been killed by the military at the time. And you'll notice here this international delegate member is actually from Cuba. Her name was Candelaria Rodriguez, and she was a lawyer by profession. And if you remember the history, I mean, we all associate Cuba with communism now, but this was 1951, before the Cuban Revolution in 1959. So she was actually going against her government in joining this delegation, and she was one of the people to suffer repercussions as a result, because when she went back, she was fired from her job, and she was briefly imprisoned as a traitor. But you'll notice that she's, you know, trying to comfort the Korean women that she meets, and she's visibly distraught, you know, as she's listening to the Korean women talking about the effects of the war on their lives. So I wanted to now jump very quickly to talk about the continuation of the women's involvement to bring peace to the Korean Peninsula. There were many other efforts after this. In fact, you know, in 1953, I guess I should just go back. In 1953, when the armistice was signed, just a couple of weeks ago, we I guess commemorated the anniversary of the signing of the armistice, the 67th year signing of the armistice agreement. But because it was simply a ceasefire rather than a permanent peace settlement, women that were part of this organization, the Women's International Democratic Federation, were very active in supporting the North Korean women. The North Korean women were members of this international organization through the Korean Democratic Women's Union. So you can see, if you look at the journal articles and the correspondences between the two organizations, there's an active movement for solidarity to try to bring a permanent peace settlement to the Korean Peninsula that, again, is very little known. I think, in either among scholars or even just, among regular people. So this is, in jumping from 1951 to 2015, I don't mean to say that there was nothing going on in between. There was very active movements going on. And I think Dr. Pei will talk a little bit more, I think, about the way that the ecumenical and religious women were really involved in the peace movement during this time, especially trying to overcome the division of the Cold War that made it very difficult for women across the so-called Iron Curtain to try to find solidarity. So there was an active movement, but this is just to say that, just to introduce some of the more recent activism of women against the Korean War. So in 2015, which was that would have been the 70th anniversary of the division of Korea in 2015, there was this real sense of urgency to try to bring that division to a final end, to try to reunify and bring peace to the Korean Peninsula. So some of the diasporic Korean American women decided that it would be important to highlight the fact that the DMZ, the demilitarized zone, still exists and it still divides Korea after all of these years, and that the international community has an important obligation to try to bring peace, as they were instrumental in dividing the Korean Peninsula and also engaged in the Korean War. The Korean War started as a civil war, but then it ended up becoming an international war where you had 16 different countries participating on the side of the United Nations alongside South Korea. And then you also had the Soviet Union and China supporting the North Korean side. So it was very much an international conflict. And so the international community has an obligation to try to finally end this war. And so we made this attempt to try to cross the DMZ. Now, unlike the name, the demilitarized zone, it's actually one of the most heavily militarized places on Earth. And so it took about a whole year of negotiations between all sides, South Korean government, North Korean government, and the United Nations to try to see if we can do this. And finally, we got approval to do it. And May 19th, it wasn't necessarily planned that way, but it just so happened that May 25th is celebrated throughout the world as the International Day for, Women's International Day for Disarmament. And so we chose May without necessarily knowing that it was overlapping with that earlier delegation in 1951. But in retrospect, it's kind of, it's a really interesting coincidence that both of these events took place in May. So we landed in Pyongyang in May 19th of 2015. And here you'll see, if you look at the photo, there's some major personalities that gave us the kind of international attention that we were looking to get. You see Gloria Steinem here. You see Gloria Steinem, major feminist icon from the United States. This is Mairead, who won the Nobel Peace Prize for bringing peace to Northern Ireland. And this is Lema Bowie, who is from Liberia, who was also very instrumental in bringing peace to the civil war in Liberia. There are other, and these two holding up the signs in pink, they're co-founders of Code Pink. Code Pink was a women's peace organization that was founded basically in the aftermath of the invasion of Iraq, standing against the war. And so I think I calculated that if you combine the experiences of all of these women's peace activism together, it was something like 600 years of experience of women working on peace. We spent about 4-5 days in North Korea, and one of the significant events that we held at that time was an international peace symposium. And as part of that symposium, we brought what's called a 조각보, or 보자기, Korean style a cloth that's made up of pieces of leftover cloth. And the idea was that we would bring pieces created by diasporic Koreans, by international women, by the South Korean women and the North Korean women, and then stitch it together as a symbolic action that would stitch together the division of Korea to bring it all together. And so this is at the symposium where we actually, you can identify the North Korean women with the pins on their lapels. But it's all of the women basically coming together to stitch together these different pieces that we brought along. And it was probably, I mean, I think all of the women, the international delegation that we took at that time was made up of 30 women from 15 different countries. Some of the countries having been participants in the Korean War. And I think all of the women probably would agree that it was one of the more moving and significant events that we had there, because in some ways it was very spontaneous. And being spontaneous in North Korea can be a challenge sometimes. And here we were unveiling the giant stitched together cloth, the 조각보, that all of the women worked on together. And then immediately after that, everybody spontaneously the North Korean women broke into a song about reunification, which was also moving. A couple of days after that, we went and did a peace walk in the outskirts of the city, heading out towards our next destination, which was in Kaesong. But what's interesting to note is that even in North Korean architecture, there's representations of women being an important player in the reunification of Korea. This is called the reunification statue or memorial. Two Korean women in the traditional Korean dress is holding up the 3 principles of reunification, which is a peaceful, autonomous, and united reunification. And this is where we were told that 5,000 Pyongyang resident women came out, organized by their respective organizations to join this peace walk. And you see here at the head of the, they called it a march. We wanted to call it walk because a march is very it has militaristic connotations, but they didn't quite understand the nuances of that. And so they insisted on using march and we insisted on calling it a walk. And here you see some of our leaders here. And again here, the 5,000 women that were there in the Korean dress. And they all held up these, this is very iconic. It's nothing new, I should say. Whenever you see marches organized in North Korea, a lot of the women and the men hold up these kind of like batons or flowers. And then this is a second march that we took on the day of the actual crossing. May 24th was the day of the crossing. And so we were in Kaesong. This was the city that's very close to the DMZ, the border between North and South Korea. And it's one of the oldest cities. It used to be a capital back during the Goryeo dynasty in pre-modern Korea. And because it was so close to the border, and this is actually where the armistice negotiations took place for 2 whole years between 1951 to 1953, it's one of the very few places in North Korea where not everything was bombed to bits because of the negotiations taking place. And so one of the places we stayed at was this very old, older building that doesn't exist in any other part of North Korea. Because as you saw with the earlier photos, North Korea, about 80% of North Korea was completely leveled by bombs. So then here, about 2,000 women joined us, and you can kind of, I think, tell from even the way that they're dressed that it's not quite the urban women that you saw in the earlier photo. And here, one of the more moving moments was when, these older women who probably were not, they wouldn't be able to kind of do the walk with us, but they were cheering us on from their windows. They were overlooking the route of our march, and they were cheering us from their windows, which is really heartwarming. This is where the actual armistice was signed, this building that you see here. And we did a little ceremony here of trying to, again, kind of do a little march with the 조각보, the stitched fabric that we brought with us. And this is I'm sure many of the listeners, many of the people that are on the call, on the webinar today, have seen this very iconic photo of this is called Panmunjom. So the when the summit happened, both between the North and South Korean leaders in 2018, and also between President Trump and the North Korean leader, this is where they were at, and they were able to actually walk across that, which was a really amazing moment. We haven't seen very much progress since that time, but hopefully we can gain some momentum once the craziness of the elections are over. So it's a little bit difficult to explain, but essentially there's two different ways to cross the DMZ. One is through this location here, the Panmunjom, which is what we had hoped to be able to do. But essentially they said, no can do, this is a militarized area and the military is not going to give you access. So what we ended up having to do last minute was to reroute our border crossing through what's called the Kaesong Highway. This is the highway that is used by North and South Korea to transport materials on a daily basis if they can do that sort of thing. When there's good relations between the North and South, they're able to do that. And this is also where the highway connects South Korea to the Kaesong Industrial Complex. The Kaesong Industrial Complex was one of the major outcomes, positive outcomes of the first summit in 2000 between Kim Dae-jung and the North Korean leader. And it was supposed to bring together South Korean capital and technology with North Korean labor so that you could actually have an industrial complex there. And that functioned all the way until 2016 when it was shut down. And there's been some talk about potentially reopening that, but that has not happened yet. But that's the highway that we used. And because nobody was there, the Kaesong Industrial Complex had already been closed. So the highway was not really being actively used at the time. So when we got off to actually do the border crossing, there was nobody there, but there's just us. And so this is the photo that you see. But I thought symbolically, it was important to do this to show that, we can cross borders, that it is actually possible to do. This is at one point when we got off. So we didn't actually want to take a bus across this whole highway. We wanted to be able to walk across it. But again, we faced the challenge of having to negotiate that with the UN command. So you'll see here soldiers, both South Korean, but also US soldiers who have jurisdiction over the DMZ. So this is, again, I think a good representation of some of the challenges that we face in thinking about bringing peace to the Korean Peninsula, because it's not just, as much as we want to insist that it is the autonomous, that the Koreans have a right to self-determination, no doubt. But there are all of these international interests that are at play and that are already there. And so these are the roadblocks that we need to get rid of or overcome. So this is when we finally crossed the DMZ and we're now in South Korea. All of these people were there to greet us, and so we did another march or a peace walk with the South Korean women. And here you'll see how important some of the ecumenical, the religious women leaders were. There were nuns that were there to try to add kind of gravity and protect us. I say protect us because there was actually a counter protest by some of the conservative forces in South Korea who were very much against us doing this walk. They were there to protest us. And so then, a lot of the religious community leaders came out to support us, which was really moving also. Here's another photo from that walk. And here's the final. So I'll just end. I know that I think I've pretty much run out of time. I just wanted to signal to those of you that might be interested in joining the campaign to end the Korean War. Basically, after the 2015 walk, what happened was all of the women that were there, even though we had come together for the walk, decided that, the issue is very important and we can't just end one-off on a walk. We have to continue to organize until the Korean War is finally over. And so a global campaign was launched, bringing in other major partners. One of the major partners is the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, which is the oldest women's peace organization in the world today. I think they were formed in like 1915. So then, they're over 100 years old now. So they're one of our major partners. And there's several others. If you go to this website, you can find out more about this campaign, and there are ways to join. You can join a local chapter if one already exists, or you can create one of your own. Just go to the website and then look under Contact Us, and you'll find more information about how to do that. And then I just wanted to end with a shout out to a very recent campaign launched in South Korea by civic groups on the anniversary of the armistice just last month. Over 300 civic organizations came together to launch a signature campaign. Their aim is to gather 100 million signatures by 2023, which would be the 70th anniversary of the signing of the armistice, and to deliver that to the UN and the two Korean governments, as well as the US and China, to really urge these governments to come to the table to finally bring peace to the Korean Peninsula. So with that, I'll just say, the movement continues on, and I hope many of you will be interested to join it.